During my very first play session with Lost Ark, I got to see the game's first two dungeons, Toxiclaw Cavern and Aquiloc's Head. These are located in the first couple of zones that you come across, and they were clearly meant to give a basic introduction to the game's dungeon system. As such, they were pretty straightforward and stripped down experiences. I did briefly cover this in my last video, but as you can tell by the title, dungeons are the focus of this one, so I want to go into a bit more detail about how this whole thing works. Now, like I said, those first two dungeons were fairly basic, rather bare bones even, I would call them. Each of them had one very linear path with just a few groups of enemies scattered throughout, as well as a few simple objectives to complete as you made your way down the path. And then at the very end, there was one rather straightforward boss fight. Now, I didn't go in expecting anything grandiose from the first couple of dungeons in the MMO starter zones. That would be a ridiculous expectation. That said, though, these were simple and basic enough that they really didn't leave much of an impression at all. Like, they didn't really feel any different from any special questing area that you might come across in the game. Now, after making that video, I continued playing and I came across the game's third dungeon, which was Aquiloc's Trail, and this was basically more of the same. I went in, followed a linear path, killed some enemies, completed some tasks, and then of course I reached the end and I fought the big boss. So at this point, I was several hours in, I had experienced my first 3 dungeons in the game, and I just assumed that this basic formula is what we were going to get for leveling dungeons. Going forward, it would be these linear paths. I'd get one of them in about every zone. I'd go through it, kill the boss, and I'd just do it for a little bit of experience and for the epic gear that it would drop. However, as I continued to play, I realized that this is not the case, and the dungeons get much cooler. At around level 19, I think it was, I unlocked the game's 4th dungeon, which is called Morai Ruins. And it was such a cool and immersive cinematic experience that I decided to make an entire video about it. Like, this is easily one of the coolest leveling dungeons that I have seen in any MMO I've played. I don't want to oversell it, I promise you. I mean, at its core, you're still doing the basic combat, you're fighting the bosses, but it really comes down to the presentation. I think that's what does it. Lost Ark's regular use of these camera pans to show off the environment, it's just something that I have not seen often in isometric games, and I think it really adds a lot. So what I want to do is take you through a run and show you this dungeon experience and talk a bit more about the different elements of it and what I liked so much. I just thought this was really cool, especially for a leveling dungeon in an MMO. I just was not expecting it. So we're going to jump in. I'm going to talk all about it. But first, let's get a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Ridge Wallet. They sent me a couple of these, and I've been using them recently on the rare occasions that I leave the house. The first thing I noticed with the Ridge Wallet was just how compact it is, especially compared to the wallet I've been using for quite some time, which has always felt so bulky. I really appreciated the smaller profile of this. The other thing that I've really enjoyed is the tactile experience. It just kind of feels good. It's got like a nice weight to it. Ridge wallets are made of what they say are military grade materials. I don't know exactly what that means, but from what I've used, it's felt really solid and durable. On top of that, they've got a lifetime warranty, and apparently as well, you can try them risk-free for 45 days, and if you don't like it, you can send it back for a full refund. Some notable points here are that Ridge wallets can hold up to 12 cards, along with having room for cash. There are over 30 colors and different styles available to choose from, and they've got over 40,000 5-star reviews. So that is the Ridge wallet. If you guys are interested in trying it out for yourself, there is a link in the description below, and if you use the code FORCE, you'll get 10% off your order. Okay, so let me take you through the Morai Ruins and go over everything about that dungeon run and what I like so much about it. From the get-go, they do a bunch of scene setting and narrative exposition in this dungeon. You start off at the entrance of this like dark underground cavern. There's a priest with you, and he uses his staff to clear this path. You're making your way down, and eventually you come across this large statue. You interact with it, and it shines this light on this tablet, which gives you a little hint, and then the priest noticed that, hey, there's a nearby rock wall, and it seems like something's behind it. So he blasted open and exposing the entrance to the entire ruins, which is predominantly the dungeon that you're going through. And right away here, they play this cutscene, and it is so, I just think it was such a cool way to be introduced to a dungeon. Again, especially in an isometric game, I think it was just really neat getting to see these areas that you're about to explore from a different perspective. While you're playing in the gameplay itself, the camera is locked in position, but so often they move things around and they give you a different view of the world, and I just really like it. I think the camera pans are really, really well done in this game. So after the dungeon flyby finishes, there's a horde of enemies descending upon us. You know, apparently they heard that rock wall exploding. So we clear them out, we make our way towards the ruins, but just as I jump down, some more enemies show up, separating the priest and I, and from here I have to continue alone. So at this point, it's about 3 minutes into the dungeon run, and it's basically just all been a narrative introduction. For my very first run, I enjoyed watching this presentation. This sort of thing does continue throughout it, and again, it's a big part of the reason I liked the dungeon experience so much. It is worth noting though that you are able to skip these cutscenes in future runs if you want to get into the action quicker, which you probably will, but the first time around watching them I thought was really, really great. Okay, so now we actually get into the gameplay itself. Immediately there's a group of basic demons. They're just some fodder enemies. Pretty easy stuff, you know, they normally just take a couple hits, you group them up, you take them out, pretty simple. Right at the beginning they get into the context sensitive traversal as I have to jump this gap here. You know, there's nothing really interesting gameplay wise about these in Lost Ark, but I do think their inclusion adds this extra layer to the experience rather than just simply walking down another hallway or path. They just kind of mix it up a little bit, and I appreciate the variety. I also want to say here, I just loved the look and the theming of this dungeon. I think this was another reasons that I liked it so much. It's got this real sunken temple vibe, if you know what I mean. In fact, story-wise, it is quite literally a subterranean ruin. You've got all this like overgrown vegetation, the water shimmering and reflecting light all over the place. I just think it looks really good. So I cross over this narrow ledge, and then the game does the Legend of Zelda thing where it shows you your obstacle and then it pans to the thing that you need to bypass it. Now, unlike most Zelda games that I've played, this was immediately easily accessible. I didn't have to do much. It was literally just like the lever was right there next to me. So I go up, I pull it, and this lifts a gate, draining the water. We get another one of those camera pans showing this happening, and then it shows you the next lever you need to reach. So I continue my way through the ruins, smashing through some basic fodder enemies. I jump a few gaps, I pull the second and then the third lever, and this empties out the remaining water, and with that water drained, a new pathway opens up to, I kid you not, the sunken temple. It really is. So I start making my way over there. Some new enemies started showing up around this time as well. Beyond the basic fodder enemies and the casters, we had these large stone warriors that would come to life as you got close to them. You know, like everything else that's not a boss though, they were chopped down pretty easily. Just takes a couple of hits really, but it's some more variety. I continue forward and am introduced to my first ever environmental hazard. This was the first time I'd seen one of these in the game. They were these spike traps. They would shake right before they activated, and you just had to navigate across without getting hit and without dying. I did it. It wasn't pretty, but I did make it to the other side. I then head up some stairs and am introduced to the very first boss encounter of this dungeon. So unlike the previous ones, there are multiple bosses in these larger dungeons, which is really nice. This one's called Gatekeeper Ramos. He had a couple attacks that I had to dodge. There was this frontal cone. He would leap with a fairly large impact radius you have to get out before it expanded. Also with him was an army of those stone warriors, and they would get in your way and just try to inhibit your movement as you were trying to avoid his attacks, so you'd want to clear them out. This fight wasn't that difficult. I popped my ultimate and was able to burst him down pretty quickly. I did get hit with a couple attacks, which ended up causing some knockdowns that slowed up my DPS. It was a sloppy victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. So after Ramos, there was another section with some environmental hazard. You had to dodge these walls slamming into each other. Just like the spikes, these would shake before they activated. Not sure what happens if you get hit. I'm assuming death here, but you just have to kind of do this inch forward and then keep making your way through. I made my way through to the next corridor, and here there were one of these hidden rooms. These have been in most of the dungeons that I've seen. Inside of the rooms are these Makoko seeds. It's just one of the collectibles in the game, and it plays into things like the zone completion, which will reward you some currency and items. I then go on and have to kill a group of these shamans. I break down a door, and then I take this floating raft downstream to the next part of the dungeon. I fight my way up through these ruins ruins onto a massive platform, at which point I come across the second boss fight. This is the Shaman Captured in Darkness, kind of a funny name, but yeah. She was surrounded by a load of demons, and she could also summon some stone warriors. She had this projectile attack I would have to dodge, as well as an AoE spell that she would cast underneath you wherever you were standing. So basically I just had to keep moving, clear out the ads, and then get up and take her down, which was fairly easy, again, because of my ultimate. These bosses haven't been terribly challenging, but again, these are like mini bosses on the way to the main boss. After her, there were just a few more paths for me to walk down. There was also some more traversal. I had to jump and like go down this rope slide. And then I reached the final room with the last boss of the dungeon. And it's Diablo, basically. It's a big beast. It's got horns. It's called the Lords of Darkness. The whole thing was kind of cheeky. I liked it. Now, this was the most interesting fight as well that I've seen in the game so far. For one, he had a ground slam that would spawn damage pools you had to steer clear of. And then he had this very, very large cone attack to dodge. There was a charge that would knock you down if you got hit. You don't want that to happen. And then he was also multiple phased. So once you whittle him down, his first chunk of health bars, he would retreat into this protective wall and move on to the second phase. Now, the first time he retreated, there's a cinematic that plays. He like powers up and then comes back stronger than before. He does have the same attacks as the first phase, as far as I could tell, although I do believe everything hits a little harder. So you work down his health bars again. He retreats again. At this point, you actually have to grab an object on the ground. It's this mirror. You pick it up and then you have to redirect a beam of light onto him, which works down his protective shield or something. And then he moves into the third and final phase. He's got all of those prior attacks as well as some new ones. I did see this new area explosion with a fast activation, which was different from the prior phases. These ones were a little harder to dodge, but again, you work down his health bar, he retreats again, you shine the light on him one final time, and then that is a wrap. Now, like I said at the start, I don't want to oversell this, but at the same time, I thought the whole thing was really cool. At its core, the things that you're doing, like mechanically, there's nothing super out of the ordinary. The combat is all the combat you're doing throughout the rest of the game with all your abilities. You're rooted in place. You're working on positioning and trying to not get hit, dodging attacks. You know, the boss fights, they have their area attacks, their cone attacks, their charges, but nothing too crazy. Although we did have that interesting additional mechanic with shining the light beam onto the final boss. But what it is, I feel like, is that the whole thing just comes together when you put all of those pieces in place. So the combat as it is, it feels good. I like the combat in this game. Really, the addition of things like the traversal, instead of just constantly going through halls, having the things where you're jumping and you're climbing ladders and you're going down rope swings or whatever. And then also having all of these camera pans showing the environment in a different way. I mean, I think back to my time with Diablo and that it would happen so rarely, but they're constantly doing this in this game, especially in these dungeons, these big ones like this. You're always seeing that environment at a different perspective, and it really gives you a greater sense of scale, and it's more of a cinematic experience. It's really cool. And then finally, again, we had like those hazards, which were a new introduction here with the spike traps and the slamming walls. And really it is, I feel like, all of those pieces coming together that made me want to make this video, because I really appreciated going through this so much. Now, after I finished my very first solo clear of this dungeon, I immediately wanted to rerun it. However, I wanted to try it with a group because I hadn't done any group content yet. Pretty simple. You go back to the entrance and you just select matchmake. I found a group in like less than a minute, and going through the second time, the experience felt very similar in terms of like how fast we were able to clear mobs and what we were fighting against. I didn't see any new enemies or anything, and enemies seem to die relatively in the same amount of time. It does appear like the game does adjust difficulty with the number of players. I believe I've read this as well. So if you go in solo or as a group of 2 or a full group of 4, things will scale accordingly. We didn't have too many deaths, and overall things did go smoothly, although I do want to give you a heads up. It looks like when you're doing group runs, Most people in these groups seem to prefer to skip the cutscenes, so if you're interested in seeing that stuff, best to go in solo, at least for the very first time. I've had zero difficulty clearing stuff, even on hard mode by myself, so don't be afraid to try these dungeons solo. At least while leveling up, it seems totally viable. So Morai Ruins, the big one that I just showed you, this has easily been one of the biggest, most elaborate dungeons I've seen in the game. I've played, I want to say it's 16 hours total throughout the course of this test. As I continued playing, I unlocked it was 5 or 6 additional dungeons. Most of them were smaller than the Morai Ruins, except for one. The second large-scale dungeon I came across was called King Lutera's Tomb. Similarly, this thing was awesome. The sense of scale, the theatrics behind it, and all of that camera panning. I'm just going to keep talking about it because I just think it really adds something to this game, to this isometric game. So in here, we started out by moving through this haunted graveyard. There was this ghost of a mage that would help me navigate the graveyard, as well as the help of this holy lantern that I found. This thing was really cool because it gave me access to some unique abilities. They were these super powerful light attacks. I could clear out groups of enemies really easily. I had to go through the graveyard, activate the beacons, eventually made my way out of the graveyard and towards the king's tomb. I had to take this elevator down, and I got another one of these great cinematic shots. It showed the whole front of the tomb, which I was about to go into, and then climb this large winding stone staircase. And as I'm doing that, a massive demon is chasing me the entire time, and it's this super like drawn out multi-phase fight where you have to combat him in multiple sections of the staircase climb, and it all culminates with a big fight on the top. It was all so cool. It was all so neat. Again, these are just dungeons. They are just leveling dungeons as well. Like I haven't even taken a look at the end game stuff. I just didn't get the opportunity to reach it in this playtest. But I guess the biggest thing for me is that I was simply not expecting this sort of like presentation and this sort of cinematic experience from leveling dungeons in an isometric top-down ARPG/MMO. The gameplay, it's all fairly straightforward stuff, and the mechanics that I've seen so far aren't the interesting or cool part. It really is all about the presentation. I've really liked it. And hopefully this video did a good job of showcasing some of what that's like. It's never going to be the same as just experiencing it for yourself. Lost Ark is a game that I was anticipating, I've been looking forward to, but really having played it, I'm sold at this point. There's a lot of really interesting things about it. You know, it is another MMO. It is going to be a grind fest. How much of your time are you going to spend with this game? How much of my time am I going to spend with it? I don't know, but at the very least, I do think that I'm going to jump in and do a full playthrough, check out the game in its entirety, and get a little bit of the taste for the end game, but probably without stepping on that gear treadmill, because kind of think those days are behind me. I'd rather just see the game, check out as much content as I can, and not grind day after day for incremental gear increases. Which is really strange because I love MMOs, but I'm way over that at this point. But anyways, there you go. That is a look at the dungeon experience from what I've seen so far in Lost Ark. I'm looking forward to seeing more, looking forward especially to checking out the end game. I know raids are a thing, and I can only imagine if the leveling dungeons provided such a cool experience that made me want to make a whole video about it. I can only imagine what the raids are going to be like, so looking forward to seeing it. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.